Well, every once in a while, I like to do a series that talks about Jesus scholarship. I'm always reading books by the scholars on Jesus, and every once in a while I just like to kind of give you an update on what I'm reading and how things are changing in the world of scholarship and thinking about Jesus. And I think it's important, I think it's part of my job to talk about that and keep everyone up to date and informed. I actually don't remember that the pastors I grew up with talked about the scholarship that they were reading when I was in church growing up. And I wish they had. And I'm not the only one. I recently read a book by a biblical scholar whose name is Dale Allison. And I think Allison teaches at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. And the book is called The Historical Christ and the Theological Jesus. And he's written a lot of kind of dense scholarly works on Jesus' history, but this is a book where he talks more about his personal experience in church and at seminary and asks the question, in essence, of what purpose or use is Jesus' scholarship to the church. And in the beginning of the book, he talks about his own experience growing up in a church, a couple different churches, in a Presbyterian church and then a Congregational church, and says this: "Ignorance, it is said, is voluntary misfortune. Still, one expects something from one's teachers. Either my pastors knew nothing about the debates regarding Jesus, or they consciously kept a convenient silence. Perhaps they were persuaded that their congregants did not need to know what they knew, and maybe they worried that curiosity might kill the Christian. I recall that Maldonatus says somewhere, 'It is the duty for us to doubt for others, lest they doubt for themselves.' In any case, my pastors failed one inquisitive teenager miserably. I had to stumble onto the almost invisible topic all on my own, without help from the church. And then I had to wonder, sitting alone in my bedroom, why all the secrecy?" And the invisible topic is simply scholarship about the historic Jesus, which has now been going on in earnest for 2 centuries. Which means that no matter how old we are, if we grew up in a church in any mainstream denomination, our seminary-trained pastors were exposed to biblical scholarship, whether they were talking about it to their churches or not. We are now done with our third, what's called, quest for the historic Jesus. 3 different periods over the last 2 centuries where there has been a dedicated interest in kind of rethinking Jesus' scholarship in light of whatever the latest social science theories were and the latest archaeological finds were and the latest studies that were coming into biblical scholarship from history and from other fields. And there have been 3, each one decades-long quests, where you have for a while a really dedicated effort on scholars to say, this is what we are learning about Jesus, this is what we think about Jesus. And then it dies off for a while, and then a new group of scholars comes along and kind of picks it up again in light of later generational thinking and findings. And the most recent quest includes scholars that I have read and talked about here, and that I think many of you have also read, people like Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan. And the fact that many of you have read some of these books suggests to me that it's more difficult to be ignorant now, unless one really is trying to be willfully ignorant. Because what's happened recently that's different in this last quest is that many biblical scholars have found that there's actually an interest among those sitting in churches, whether the pastors are talking about it or not. Those who go to bookstores and now those who get online are able for themselves to go out there and to read the books that have been published by a whole host of scholars representing a whole variety of theological perspectives. And what was once an academic debate has now spilled over into the mainstream for anyone who is interested to read and to learn. But that leads me to another observation about this quest. It's one I talked about a little bit last week. It's confusing, which is perhaps why some pastors choose not to talk about it. Because there are as many Jesuses as there are scholars. And they are not all the same. Just to name a few of the more popular recent authors that some of you would be familiar with. There's the Jesus of N.T. Wright, Tom Wright, who is the Anglican Bishop of Durham, England, and a first-rate biblical scholar who's written many books, who has Jesus as a Jewish prophet and a very, at least to my reading, Orthodox Christian. Matter of fact, he sounds kind of Anglican. There's the Jesus of Marcus Borg, who is a religious mystic who dispenses perennial wisdom. There's the Jesus of Dale Allison, who I just was talking about, and we'll be talking about a little bit more, who believes that Jesus was a Jewish eschatological prophet who believed that the end was near and who thought that he was part of that end. There's the Jesus of John Dominic Crossan, who was always my favorite Jesus, who was a Galilean but cynic-like peasant, whose vision of an egalitarian kingdom and nonviolent God stood in stark contrast to the power of the Roman Empire and Roman domination. And that's just four of many. If you go into the conservative scholarship, there's as many different Jesus there as there are on the more mainstream. And why? When you begin to read all of them, you wonder why are there so many different Jesuses? And I talked about this last week. It's because the only Jesus we know is the Jesus of memory. And even in current events, no one remembers the same event in the same way. Even if all of us were to witness a crime or some event, our reporting of it would be different. Our memories, we don't have a camera running in there that just records things as they happen. We have a mind that has a memory. And the memory is a part of our mind. And our memories are shaped by genetics and culture and our upbringing and our past experiences. And so we can all see the same event, but we will process that event, remember it, and report on it in a different way. And that's true with every historic figure. Think about George Washington, our first president. We have written documents by George. And so we have more historical information about him than we do about Jesus. Because as far as we know, Jesus didn't write anything. And yet, if you venture into the scholarly world of George, you will discover that there is great disagreement about his significance. And our own popular imagination of George includes legends, including cutting down the cherry tree and things like that we all learn. At least I think we still all learn it, but I learned it. You probably learned it growing up. Cutting down the cherry tree. And in the scholarly world, there's no agreement at all about who he was. and what his significance was. And as I said last week, it's one of the curious things about history and memory that the more significant a person is in history, the more different interpretations and memories there will be about that person. And that is very true about Jesus.